The smoke that poured from the iron stove was so thick and black that Derla thought for one terrifying moment the entire farmhouse might be on fire. And she stood frozen in the middle of the kitchen, with a wooden spoon clutched in her green hand while her eyes watered, and her tusks seemed to ache with the sheer humiliation of it all. She had been hired exactly 3 hours ago by the tall human man with the sun-weathered face and the laugh lines around his eyes, hired to cook and keep house in exchange for room, board, and enough coin by spring to buy passage north to the territories where orcs were said to live without fear. And now she had managed to burn his evening meal into something that resembled charcoal more than food. The smell was acrid and terrible, a combination of scorched meat and blackened vegetables that made her stomach turn, and when she finally mustered the courage to lift the heavy pot from the stove and carry it to the wooden table, she could see that the stew inside had transformed into a bubbling tar-like substance that clung to the sides of the pot with stubborn malevolence. Derla set the pot down with a thunk that seemed too loud in the small kitchen, and forced herself to look up when she heard footsteps on the porch. The door swung open and Warren Ingram walked in, bringing with him the smell of pine trees and fresh air and the cold bite of early autumn evening. He was a trapper by trade. She had learned during their brief interview that morning, and he moved with the easy confidence of someone who spent more time in the wilderness than among people. His hair was dark brown and slightly too long, falling into his eyes when he bent to pull off his boots, and there was something about the way he carried himself that suggested he found the world quietly amusing even when it probably should not be. "Something smells interesting," Warren said, and Derla wanted to sink through the floorboards because interesting was clearly the kindest possible word for the disaster she had created. "I burned it," she said flatly, because there was no point in pretending otherwise. "I burned the entire meal. I am sorry. I will pack my things." She had learned long ago not to make excuses when things went wrong, because excuses only made humans angrier, and it was better to accept whatever punishment was coming and move on. Her hands were already reaching for the apron strings at her waist, already preparing to fold the worn fabric and set it on the counter before she gathered her few belongings from the tiny room off the kitchen that Warren had shown her earlier. She had been foolish to think she could do this, foolish to think that a girl who had spent most of her life scrounging for food in border camps and trading posts would somehow know how to cook a proper human meal. Warren crossed the kitchen in a few long strides and peered into the pot with the air of someone examining a particularly fascinating rock. His nose wrinkled slightly, but the smile did not leave his face, and when he looked up at Derla, his hazel eyes were bright with something that might have been laughter. "Well," he said thoughtfully, "it is definitely burned. I will give you that. But I have eaten worse, and I am hungry enough that I would probably eat tree bark if you put enough salt on it." He picked up a wooden bowl from the shelf and ladled a generous portion of the ruined stew into it before Derla could protest. The blackened chunks of what had once been rabbit and turnips slopped into the bowl with an unappetizing plop, and steam rose from the mess in lazy spirals. Warren carried the bowl to the table, sat down on one of the rough-hewn chairs, and picked up a spoon. Derla watched in horrified fascination as he took a bite, chewed thoughtfully, and swallowed. "Not bad," he said, which was such an obvious lie that Derla felt something between gratitude and indignation rise in her chest. "A bit crunchy, maybe, smoky, has character." "It is terrible," Derla said, still standing frozen by the stove. "You do not have to pretend." Warren grinned at her, and it was such a genuine, unguarded expression that she felt something in her chest twist painfully. "Oh, it is absolutely terrible," he agreed cheerfully. "Worst thing I have tasted in months. But I am still hungry, and wasting food seems like a shame when there are perfectly good burned bits that will fill my stomach just fine. Mind if I have another helping? Derla stared at him. In her 18 years of life, she had encountered many human reactions to failure. Anger, disgust, cold dismissal, the kind of mocking laughter that cut deeper than any blade. But she had never, not once, encountered this easy acceptance, this willingness to eat charcoal stew with a smile and ask for more. Her fingers loosened on the apron strings. "You are serious," she said slowly. "Dead serious." I like a woman who commits fully to her cooking style, even if that style is apparently cremation. Warren took another bite and made an exaggerated face of concentration. "I think I can taste something that used to be a turnip, or maybe a potato. Hard to tell at this point." Despite herself, despite the mortification still burning in her cheeks and the fear still coiled in her belly, Derla felt the corner of her mouth twitch. It was not quite a smile, because she was not ready to believe this was real yet, but it was close. She moved slowly to the table and sat down across from Warren, her hands folded in her lap, and watched as he finished his bowl and actually did serve himself another helping. "Why did you hire me?" she asked quietly. "You put out the notice for a cook and housekeeper. You must have known I might not be good at either." Warren set down his spoon and leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression that was thoughtful rather than calculating. "I needed help," he said simply. "My mother passed last winter, and since then this place has been falling apart around me. I can trap and hunt and fix a roof, but I cannot cook worth a damn, and the house looks like a pack of raccoons has been living in it. The notice said I wanted someone willing to work hard and learn. Did not say anything about already being perfect at it. But an orc," Derla said, because this was the part that never made sense. "Most humans would not, most humans are idiots," Warren interrupted mildly. "Present company excluded, of course. You showed up. You were honest about what you could and could not do, and you were willing to try. That is more than I can say for the 3 human girls who came by before you and spent the whole time looking down their noses at everything and asking if I had servants to help with the heavy work." He snorted. "This is a frontier trapper's homestead, not a lord's manor. I need someone who is not afraid to get their hands dirty, and I figured an orc girl trying to earn passage north would be a lot more motivated than some village girl looking for easy coin." Derla felt something warm and unfamiliar settle in her chest, something that might have been the beginning of hope. "I will learn," she said, and was surprised by how fierce her own voice sounded. "I will learn to cook properly. This will not happen again." "Oh, I expect it probably will," Warren said with a laugh. "Learning means making mistakes. Just maybe try not to burn down the house while you are at it. I am pretty fond of this place, even if it is a mess." They ate the rest of the terrible stew in companionable silence, and Derla discovered that Warren was right. It was awful, but it was filling. And there was something oddly satisfying about sitting at a table with someone who did not flinch away from her or stare at her tusks with poorly concealed disgust. When the meal was finished, Warren showed her how to work the temperamental stove, pointing out the way the left side ran hot and the right side barely heated at all, and how the chimney needed to be checked every few days, or it would smoke up the whole kitchen. "My mother knew all the tricks of this thing," he said, running a hand along the iron surface with unexpected tenderness. "She could make bread that would make angels weep and stews that tasted like comfort itself. I keep thinking I should write down all her recipes before I forget them completely, but I never seem to get around to it." Derla heard the sadness underneath the casual words and filed it away, a piece of information about this strange man who had hired her despite her obvious inadequacy. "How long has she been gone?" she asked. 7 months, Warren said. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like years. She got sick in the middle of winter, and by the time the thaw came, it was too late to get her to a healer in the village. She died here in the house, with me holding her hand." He cleared his throat and straightened, shaking off the melancholy like a dog shaking off water. "But that is not the kind of talk for a first evening. Come on, I will show you the rest of the place before it gets too dark." The farmhouse was small but sturdy, built of logs that had been chinked with clay and moss to keep out the wind. There was the kitchen where they stood, a front room with a fireplace and a few pieces of worn furniture, and a bedroom that Warren used on the ground floor. A narrow ladder led up to a loft space under the eaves, and Warren gestured to it with a wry smile. "That was my space when I was a boy," he said. "You can have the room off the kitchen, though. It is smaller, but it has got a real door and a window, and I figure you deserve some privacy." The room he showed her was indeed small, barely large enough for a narrow bed, a chest for belongings, and a hook on the wall for hanging clothes. But it was clean, and the bed had a thick quilt folded at the foot, and when Derla set her worn pack on the floor, she felt a strange tightness in her throat that she refused to acknowledge as tears. This was hers. For now, at least, this space was hers. Warren left her to settle in, and went to do his evening chores, which apparently involved checking his traps and making sure the small barn behind the house was secure for the night. Derla unpacked her few belongings: 2 changes of clothes, a whetstone, a knife that had been her father's before he died, a small pouch of coins that represented every bit of money she had managed to save in 3 years of odd jobs and hard labor, and then stood in the middle of her tiny room, breathing slowly and trying to understand what had just happened. She had been certain she would be dismissed. The burned stew had been such a complete failure that there was no possible way any reasonable person would keep her on. And yet Warren had eaten it, smiled, and asked for another helping. He had not mocked her or made her feel small. He had simply accepted the disaster and moved on, as if burned food was nothing more than a minor inconvenience rather than a reason to send her packing. Derla did not trust easily, could not afford to, not when trust had been repaid with cruelty more times than she could count, but she felt the first fragile threads of it beginning to form. Warren Ingram was either the kindest man she had ever met or a very good actor, and she would find out which over the coming days. That night, lying in her narrow bed and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the farmhouse settling around her, Derla made a promise to herself. She would learn to cook. She would learn to keep this house the way Warren's mother had kept it. She would earn her passage north, and when she left in the spring, she would leave knowing that she had repaid the strange kindness Warren had shown her. It was a good plan, a solid plan, and it did not account for the fact that Warren's grin had made something flutter in her chest in a way that had nothing to do with gratitude, and everything to do with something far more dangerous. The next morning dawned clear and cold, and Derla woke before sunrise out of long habit. She dressed quickly in the chilly air and made her way to the kitchen, determined to redeem herself. Warren had shown her where he kept the basic supplies the night before: flour and salt in sealed jars, a basket of eggs from the chickens that scratched around the yard, a side of bacon hanging in the small root cellar. Breakfast, she reasoned, could not be that hard. Eggs and bacon were simple things, things even she could manage. She was wrong. The bacon caught fire almost immediately, the flames leaping up from the pan with enthusiastic malice, and by the time she had beaten them out with a rag, the eggs had somehow welded themselves to the bottom of the second pan with the strength of mortar. Derla stood over the stove, breathing hard and fighting the urge to throw the pans out the window. When Warren appeared in the kitchen doorway looking sleep-rumpled and entirely too cheerful for someone whose breakfast was currently smoking on the stove. "Good morning," he said, as if the kitchen did not smell like a battlefield. "I see we are continuing with the theme of aggressive cooking." "I do not understand," Derla said through gritted teeth. "I followed the heat settings you showed me. I watched the food. How does it still burn?" Warren came to stand beside her and peered into the pans with the air of a scholar examining ancient texts. "That is because this stove is cursed," he said solemnly. "My mother swore it had a vendetta against anyone who was not her. I am pretty sure it tries to burn my food out of spite." "Stoves cannot have vendettas. This one does. I am convinced." Warren picked up a fork and poked at one of the charred eggs. "Tell you what, how about today we go into the village and you can watch how the baker does things? She has got an oven that actually works properly, and she might be willing to give you some tips. Meanwhile, I will make us some porridge. I can usually manage that without setting anything on fire." Derla wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she could figure this out on her own, but the practical part of her brain pointed out that watching someone who actually knew what they were doing was probably a smart idea. She stepped aside and let Warren take over the stove, scraping the ruined breakfast into a bucket for the pigs and starting fresh with a pot of oats and water. The porridge he made was plain but edible, sweetened with a little honey, and served with chunks of apple from the trees behind the house. They ate quickly, and then Warren hitched up his horse, a patient gray mare named Thistle, to a small cart, and they set off down the rutted track that led toward the village of Fernwick. The journey took the better part of an hour, winding through forests of pine and oak that were just beginning to show the gold and red colors of autumn. Warren kept up a steady stream of conversation as they rode, pointing out landmarks and telling stories about the area in a way that suggested he was trying to put Derla at ease. She learned that he had lived in this region his whole life, that his father had died when Warren was young, and that he and his mother had run the homestead together until her death. He talked about trapping with the kind of easy expertise that came from years of experience, describing the habits of mink and beaver and fox with genuine affection. "It is a good life," he said as the cart bounced over a particularly rough patch of road. "Quiet, maybe, lonely sometimes. But I like the woods better than I like most people, so it suits me fine." "Do you ever think about leaving?" Derla asked. "Going somewhere less isolated?" Warren shrugged. "Thought about it after my mother died. Figured maybe it would be easier to be somewhere that did not remind me of her at every turn. But then I realized that the memories were not the problem. The loneliness was, and running away from a lonely place just means you end up lonely somewhere else." He glanced at her with a crooked smile. "Besides, who else would take care of that cursed stove?" Derla found herself smiling back before she could stop herself, and the expression felt strange on her face, unfamiliar and fragile. Fernwick turned out to be a small village clustered around a crossroads, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and strangers were noticed immediately. Derla felt the weight of curious stares as Warren drove the cart down the main street, saw the way people's eyes lingered on her green skin and small tusks before skittering away. She was used to it, had long since developed a thick skin against the judgment of humans, but it still made her shoulders tense and her jaw clench. Warren seemed oblivious to the stares, or perhaps he simply chose to ignore them. He pulled the cart to a stop in front of a tidy building with a painted sign that read Fernwick Bakery, and the smell of fresh bread wafted out through the open door. "Come on," he said, jumping down and offering Derla a hand. "Let me introduce you to Mabel. She has been running this place for 20 years, and if anyone can teach you the secrets of not burning everything, it is her." The bakery was warm and fragrant, the walls lined with shelves holding loaves of bread and trays of pastries. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 50s with flour dusted across her apron and streaks of gray in her brown hair. She looked up when Warren entered, and her face split into a wide smile. "Warren Ingram," she said with evident delight. "I have not seen you in weeks. I was beginning to think you had been eaten by bears." "Not yet, though there is still time," Warren said with a grin. "Mabel, this is Derla. I hired her to help around the homestead, and she is trying to learn how to cook without setting fire to everything in reach. I was hoping you might be willing to give her some pointers." Mabel's eyes flickered to Derla, and for a moment there was the usual calculation, the weighing of risk versus curiosity. But then the older woman's expression softened into something that looked almost like sympathy. "Trouble with the stove, is it?" she said. "That beast of a thing your mother had. I am not surprised. That stove fought Mary for years before she finally beat it into submission." She wiped her hands on her apron and came around the counter. "Well, I cannot teach you much in one morning, but I can show you the basics. Come on back and we will start with bread. Can't go too wrong with bread if you pay attention." Derla followed Mabel into the back of the bakery, and for the next 2 hours she was introduced to the strange alchemy of baking. Mabel was a patient teacher, explaining how to judge the temperature of an oven by feel, how to knead dough until it was smooth and elastic, how to shape loaves so they would rise evenly. She did not talk down to Derla or treat her as if she were stupid, and when Derla made mistakes, and she made several, Mabel simply showed her how to fix them and moved on. "Cooking is just practice," Mabel said as she pulled a tray of golden rolls from the oven. "And paying attention. You have got to learn how your stove behaves, what its moods are. Some run hot, some run cold. You adjust for it. And you do not walk away when something is cooking. That is when things go wrong." "I think I walked away last night," Derla admitted. "Just for a moment to get water from the pump. And when I came back, everything was burning." "That stove is fast," Mabel said with a knowing nod. "Mary used to say it was like a sulky horse. You had to keep your eye on it or it would try to throw you." She handed Derla one of the fresh rolls, still warm from the oven. "Here. Taste success for once." The roll was perfect, crispy on the outside, soft on the inside with a hint of butter and salt. Derla ate it slowly, savoring the flavor, and felt a tiny spark of hope. If someone like Mabel could teach her, if she could learn to understand the temperamental stove, then maybe she could actually do this. When they emerged from the back of the bakery, Warren was sitting at one of the small tables near the window, chatting with a man Derla did not recognize. The man was older, with a thick beard and the rough hands of someone who worked outdoors, and he was laughing at something Warren had just said. But when he saw Derla, his expression shifted, the laughter dying, and he stood abruptly. "You hired an orc," the man said to Warren, his tone making it an accusation. Warren's easy smile did not falter, but Derla saw something sharpen in his eyes. "I hired help," he corrected. "And it is none of your business who I hire, Duncan." Duncan looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Warren's expression must have warned him off. He muttered something under his breath and left the bakery, the door swinging shut behind him with more force than necessary. Warren watched him go, his jaw tight, and then he turned to Derla with an apologetic grimace. "Sorry about that. Duncan is an ass, always has been." "It is fine," Derla said, though it was not really. She was used to that kind of reaction, but it still stung, still made her feel like something dirty that needed to be hidden away. Mabel clicked her tongue disapprovingly. "Do not mind Duncan. He has been sour ever since his wife left him for a traveling merchant. Blames the whole world for his problems instead of looking in a mirror." She pressed a wrapped loaf of bread into Derla's hands. "You come back whenever you want more lessons, girl. I will be here." The kindness was unexpected, and Derla found herself stammering out thanks before following Warren back to the cart. They rode home in silence for a while, the bread warm in Derla's lap, and she could feel Warren glancing at her from time to time as if he wanted to say something but could not find the words. "I meant what I said," he finally offered as they turned off the main road onto the track that led to his homestead. "Duncan is an ass. Half the people in Fernwick are decent folks, and the other half are not worth worrying about. You do not owe anyone an explanation for being here." "You do, though," Derla said quietly. "People will talk. They will say things about you for hiring me." Warren laughed, a short bark of genuine amusement. "Let them talk. I have never cared much what people think, and I am not about to start now." He looked at her seriously, the laughter fading from his eyes. "You are here because you need work and I need help. That is the beginning and end of it. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me." The fierceness in his voice startled her, and Derla felt that dangerous flutter in her chest again, the one that whispered that Warren Ingram was more than just a kind employer. She pushed the feeling down ruthlessly. She could not afford to feel anything for this man beyond gratitude. Come spring, she would be leaving, heading north to find a place where she could live without fear, and getting attached would only make that harder. But over the following days and weeks, not getting attached proved to be impossible. Warren was easy to live with in a way Derla had not expected. He was tidy enough that the house did not descend into chaos, but relaxed enough that he did not fuss over small messes. He had a routine, checking his trap lines in the morning, working on repairs and chores in the afternoon, spending his evenings by the fire mending equipment, or reading from the small collection of books his mother had left behind, but he was flexible when things came up. He talked to Derla like she was a person rather than a servant, asking her opinion on things and actually listening to her answers. And he never, not once, made her feel like she was a burden or a mistake. The cooking improved slowly. Derla went back to Mabel's bakery twice more, learning how to make simple stews and roasted vegetables, and even a passable loaf of bread. She practiced obsessively, standing over the cursed stove and willing herself to pay attention, to catch the moment before the food went from cooked to burned. There were still failures: a pan of biscuits that came out hard as rocks, a roast that was somehow raw in the middle and charred on the outside, but there were also successes. Small victories that made Warren light up with genuine pleasure. "This is good," he said one evening, spooning up a mouthful of vegetable stew that Derla had managed not to ruin. "Really good. I think you are getting the hang of it." Derla felt a warm glow of pride that was entirely out of proportion to the accomplishment, but she could not help it. Warren's approval mattered to her in a way that was both wonderful and terrifying. She learned other things, too. She learned that Warren sang while he worked, off-key and unself-conscious, and that he had a habit of talking to the animals as if they could understand him. She learned that he was stronger than he looked, capable of hauling heavy loads and chopping wood for hours without complaint, but that he had a gentle touch when it came to things that were fragile or hurt. She learned that he still missed his mother with an ache that sometimes showed in his eyes when he thought no one was looking, and that the house was full of small reminders of her. A sampler on the wall with a stitched blessing, a rocking chair by the fire that Warren never sat in, a collection of herb jars in the kitchen that still smelled faintly of rosemary and thyme. One afternoon in late October, Derla was cleaning out the kitchen cupboards when she found a small wooden box tucked into the back of the highest shelf. It was locked, but the key was in the lock, and curiosity got the better of her. Inside were folded papers covered in neat handwriting, and when Derla unfolded the first one, she realized with a start that it was a recipe. Mary Ingram's chicken and dumplings. The top of the page read. Below that were instructions written in a flowing script, detailing measurements and cooking times, and little notes like, "Make sure the broth is boiling before you add the dumplings, or they will be soggy." Derla's hands shook slightly as she unfolded more papers. There were dozens of recipes, everything from bread to pies to stews, each one written out in careful detail. This was what Warren had been talking about, the recipes his mother had known by heart, the cooking that had made this house a home. And here they were, preserved in her handwriting, waiting to be used again. Derla carried the box down carefully and set it on the table, and when Warren came in from checking his traps, she was still sitting there, reading through the recipes with a mixture of awe and determination. "What is that?" Warren asked, setting down the brace of rabbits he had caught. "Your mother's recipes," Derla said. "I found them in the cupboard. I hope you do not mind that I looked." Warren went very still, and for a moment Derla thought she had overstepped, had intruded on something too private. But then he crossed to the table and picked up one of the papers, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting, and his expression softened. "I forgot these were here," he said quietly. "I looked for them after she died, thought maybe I could use them to keep making her dishes, but I could not find the box. Must have missed it." He set the paper down gently, as if it were made of glass. "She loved cooking. Used to say that feeding people was the best kind of magic, because it made them happy and healthy all at once." "I would like to try making some of these," Derla said. "If that is all right. I know I will probably mess them up at first, but I want to try." Warren looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that made Derla's breath catch. "I think she would have liked that," he said. "I think she would have liked you." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning, and Derla had to look away before she did something stupid like cry or, worse, reach across the table and take his hand. She busied herself with folding the recipes back into the box, her fingers clumsy, and Warren cleared his throat and went to clean the rabbits, and the moment passed. But it stayed with Derla, that look in his eyes, and late that night she lay in her narrow bed and admitted to herself what she had been trying to deny for weeks. She was falling for Warren Ingram. She was falling hard and fast and completely, and there was no way it could end well. He was human. She was an orc. He had a life here, roots that went deep into this land, and she had nothing but a plan to keep moving north until she found a place that felt safe. Even if by some miracle he felt the same way, and that was a big if, what kind of future could they possibly have? She would bring him nothing but trouble, nothing but suspicious stares and whispered insults from his neighbors. He deserved better than that. He deserved someone who could fit into his world without causing him pain. The logical thing, the smart thing, would be to keep her distance. To do her job, save her money, and leave in the spring as planned. To protect both of them from the heartbreak that would come if she let this feeling grow. But Derla had never been particularly good at doing the logical thing. November arrived with the first real cold, the kind that crept into the bones and made the farmhouse feel small and fragile against the vastness of the wilderness. Warren spent more time indoors, working on projects that had been put off during the busy autumn months, repairing harnesses, oiling traps, carving new handles for tools that had worn out. Derla kept the fire burning and worked her way through Mary Ingram's recipes, determined to master at least a few of them before winter set in fully. The chicken and dumplings were a disaster the first time. The dumplings dissolved into gluey lumps, and the broth was so salty it was almost inedible. Warren ate it anyway, pronouncing it interesting with a perfectly straight face, and Derla threw a dish towel at him in exasperation. The second attempt was better, and the third time she made it, Warren actually went back for seconds without being asked, and Derla felt a surge of triumph so intense it was almost embarrassing. "You are getting scary good at this," Warren said, wiping his bowl clean with a piece of bread. "I am going to get fat if you keep improving." "You could use a little more weight," Derla said without thinking, and then felt her cheeks heat when Warren raised an eyebrow at her. "I just mean you work hard. You should eat well." "I will take that as a compliment," Warren said, his eyes twinkling. "Though I have to say, I never thought I would hire someone who started by nearly poisoning me and ended up being the best cook I have ever had." "I am not the best cook you have ever had. Your mother was." "Fair point," Warren acknowledged. "But you are a close second, and that is saying something." They fell into a comfortable rhythm as winter approached, the kind of easy partnership that comes from working toward the same goals. Derla managed the house and the cooking, and Warren brought in firewood and game and made sure the buildings were secure against the coming storms. They ate meals together at the scarred wooden table, and in the evenings they sat by the fire, Derla mending clothes and Warren reading aloud from books with titles like The Adventures of Captain Thorne and Tales from the Southern Isles. He had a good reading voice, warm and expressive, and Derla found herself looking forward to those quiet hours more than she wanted to admit. In early December, Warren came home from the village with news that made Derla's stomach twist with anxiety. "There is going to be a winter fair in Fernwick," he said, stomping snow off his boots. "Happens every year right before the solstice. There is games and music and a baking competition that Mabel always wins. I was thinking we should go. It would be good for you to get out of the house, and you could enter the competition if you wanted. Show off what you have learned." Derla's first instinct was to refuse. The idea of standing in front of a crowd of humans being judged was enough to make her hands go clammy with fear. But then she thought about Mabel's kindness and Warren's faith in her, and the recipes she had spent months learning to master. Maybe it was time to prove to herself, if no one else, that she could do this. "What would I make?" she asked cautiously. Warren's face lit up with a grin that made him look years younger. "Anything you want. But if you made my mother's apple pie, I think you would have a real shot at winning. She took the ribbon 3 years running with that pie, and I have not had a decent one since she died." The apple pie recipe was one Derla had not tried yet, mostly because it looked intimidating. The instructions were detailed and precise, calling for a flaky crust and a filling that was perfectly balanced between sweet and tart. But if Warren thought she could do it, maybe she could. "I will need to practice," she said. "Practice all you want. I will happily eat every failed attempt." Over the next 2 weeks, Derla made apple pie 6 times. The first was a soggy mess, the crust pale and undercooked. The second burned on the edges. The third was better, but the filling was too runny. The fourth was too thick. The fifth was almost right, but the crust was not quite flaky enough. The sixth, made on a cold afternoon with snow falling softly outside the windows, was perfect. Derla pulled it from the oven and set it on the table to cool, and when Warren came in from feeding the animals, he stopped dead in his tracks, staring at the pie with an expression of wonder. "That looks exactly like hers," he said softly. "Exactly." He waited impatiently for the pie to cool enough to eat, and when Derla finally cut him a slice, he took a bite and closed his eyes. For a long moment he did not say anything, just chewed slowly, and Derla felt her heart hammering in her chest. "Well?" she demanded when she could not stand the silence anymore. Warren opened his eyes, and they were bright with unshed tears. "It is perfect," he said, his voice rough. "Derla, it is exactly like I remember. How did you do that?" I followed the recipe, Derla said, trying to downplay the warmth flooding through her. And I paid attention. It is more than that, Warren said. He set down his fork and looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. You did not just follow the recipe, you understood it. You put care into it. That is what makes the difference. Derla did not know what to say to that, so she cut herself a slice of pie and ate it in silence, and tried not to think about the fact that making Warren happy had become the most important thing in her world. The day of the winter fair arrived cold and bright, the sky a hard blue and the snow crunching underfoot. Derla dressed in her best clothes, which were not particularly fine, but at least they were clean and mended, and carefully packed the apple pie into a basket lined with cloth. Warren hitched Thistle to the cart, and they set off for Fernwick with the winter sun slanting through the bare trees. The village was transformed for the fair. The main street lined with stalls selling roasted nuts and mulled cider and small handcrafted goods. There was a fiddler playing near the crossroads, and children were running through the snow throwing snowballs and laughing. It was cheerful and chaotic, and Derla felt simultaneously drawn to the warmth of it and deeply aware that she did not belong. Warren seemed to sense her discomfort, because he stayed close as they walked through the fair, his presence a solid reassurance at her side. They stopped at Mabel's bakery to register Derla's entry for the competition, and Mabel gave the apple pie an approving nod. "That is a fine-looking pie," she said. "Mary's recipe?" "Yes," Derla said. "Warren thought I should try it. Good choice. That pie won me second place more than once, and I am a professional." Mabel winked. "You have got real competition this year, though." Constance Finch has been bragging all week that her lemon tart is going to take the ribbon. "Constance Finch," Warren muttered as they left the bakery. "Of course." "Who is Constance Finch?" Derla asked. "The most insufferable woman in 3 counties," Warren said with feeling. "She has got a house in the village and enough money that she does not have to work, so she spends all her time making sure everyone knows how refined and cultured she is. She wins the baking competition most years now that my mother is gone, and she never lets anyone forget it." As if summoned by the mention of her name, a woman's voice called out from behind them. "Warren Ingram, I heard you were bringing a competitor to the fair." They turned to find a woman in her 40s approaching, dressed in a fine wool coat and a hat with a ridiculous feather. She was handsome in a sharp-featured way, her expression one of polite disdain, and her eyes flickered over Derla with the kind of assessment that made it clear she found her lacking. "Constance," Warren said with a politeness that sounded strained. "Good to see you. Is this your entry?" Constance said, nodding toward the basket Derla carried. "How quaint. I did not realize you were teaching your help to bake." The casual cruelty of the words hit Derla like a slap, and she felt her jaw tighten. But before she could respond, Warren stepped forward, his easy smile replaced by something cold and hard. "Derla is not my help," he said, his voice quiet but edged with steel. "She is my cook and housekeeper, and she has learned more about baking in 3 months than you have probably forgotten in your entire life. And if you have got a problem with her entering the competition, you can take it up with the judges. But I guarantee you that pie she made is going to blow your lemon tart out of the water." Constance's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment she looked genuinely taken aback. Then her expression smoothed into a cool smile. "We shall see," she said. "Good luck to you both." She swept away, her coat swirling dramatically, and Warren let out a breath that sounded like he had been holding it for a while. "Sorry," he said to Derla. "She brings out the worst in me." "You did not have to defend me," Derla said, though her heart was beating fast and her hands were shaking slightly. "I can handle people like her." "I know you can," Warren said, "but that does not mean you should have to. And besides, I meant what I said. Your pie is going to win." The baking competition took place in the afternoon. The entries laid out on long tables in the village hall for the judges to taste. There were pies and tarts and cakes of every description, and the smell of sugar and spice filled the air. Derla set her apple pie down among the others and stepped back, her stomach churning with nerves. The judges were 3 respected members of the community: the village headman, the healer, and a farmer known for his orchards. They moved down the line slowly, tasting each entry and making notes, and Derla tried not to watch too closely because it only made her anxiety worse. Warren stood beside her, radiating confidence, and when the judges reached Derla's pie, he leaned over and whispered, "Watch. They are going to lose their minds." The headman cut a slice of the apple pie and took a bite. His eyebrows rose. He took another bite, chewing slowly, and then turned to the other judges with a nod. The healer tried it next, and her expression shifted from polite interest to genuine pleasure. Even the farmer, who had been looking somewhat bored, perked up when he tasted it. They moved on to Constance's lemon tart, and Derla watched as the judges tasted it with the same careful attention. It was clearly good. Constance might be insufferable, but she was not unskilled, but Derla thought she saw the healer's expression remain neutral rather than impressed. The judging took another hour, during which Derla thought she might actually be sick from nerves. Warren kept up a stream of jokes and commentary, trying to distract her, and it helped a little. Finally, the headman stepped forward and called for silence. "The judges have made their decision," he announced. "This year's winter fair baking competition has some truly exceptional entries, and it was not an easy choice. But we all agreed that one entry stood out above the rest. The winner of this year's competition is Derla Farrow for her apple pie." There was a smattering of applause, and Derla stood frozen in shock as the headman beckoned her forward. Warren gave her a gentle push, grinning like a fool, and somehow she made her legs work enough to walk to the front of the hall. The headman pressed a blue ribbon into her hand and said something complimentary that Derla barely heard over the rushing in her ears. She looked out at the crowd and saw Mabel beaming at her, saw a few friendly faces among the sea of strangers, and saw Constance Finch standing near the back with an expression that could have curdled milk. And she saw Warren, who was clapping so hard his hands had to hurt, his face alight with pride and joy. That night back at the farmhouse, they celebrated with the last slices of the winning pie and cups of hot cider. Warren was still riding high on the victory, recounting the look on Constance's face at least 3 times, and Derla found herself laughing helplessly at his dramatic reenactments. "You should have seen yourself up there," Warren said, flopping into his chair by the fire. "You looked terrified and triumphant at the same time. It was amazing." "I was terrified," Derla admitted. "I thought I was going to drop the ribbon. But you did not. You won fair and square, and you proved that you belong here just as much as anyone else." The words made Derla's throat tighten, because they were kind and they were meant well, but they were not quite true. She did not belong here. She was temporary, a hired worker passing through on her way to somewhere else. The win had been wonderful, a bright spot in a life that had held too few of them, but it did not change the fundamental reality of her situation. "I have almost enough saved," she said quietly, staring into her cider. "By spring I should have enough for passage north. Maybe even a little extra to get settled." The silence that followed her words was heavy, and when Derla finally looked up, she found Warren staring at her with an expression she could not read. "You are still planning to leave," he said, and it was not quite a question. "That was always the plan. You knew that when you hired me, I know." Warren set down his cider and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "I just thought I hoped," he stopped, shook his head. Never mind, it is your life. You should do what makes you happy. But Derla could hear what he was not saying, could see it in the tightness around his eyes and the way his shoulders had gone rigid. He did not want her to leave. And the terrible, wonderful truth was that she did not want to leave either. "Warren," she started, but he stood abruptly, cutting her off. "I am going to check the barn," he said. "Make sure everything is secure for the night. I will be back in a bit." He left before she could respond, the door closing behind him with a soft click, and Derla sat alone by the fire with her ribbon clutched in her hand and her heart aching in her chest. The days after the fair were strange. A careful dance where both Derla and Warren tried to pretend that everything was normal while the unspoken tension between them grew thicker. They were polite to each other, friendly even, but the easy warmth that had defined their relationship was muted, replaced by a cautious distance that made Derla want to scream. She threw herself into work, cleaning the house until it gleamed and cooking meals that were more elaborate than necessary. Warren spent long hours out on his trap lines, coming home late and tired and smelling of cold air and pine sap. They ate dinner together in near silence, and the evenings by the fire were filled with the sound of turning pages and crackling wood rather than Warren's voice reading aloud. It was miserable, and Derla hated it, but she did not know how to fix it without admitting the truth she was not ready to face. Winter deepened, and the snow piled high around the farmhouse, turning the world into a landscape of white and gray. The days were short, and the nights were long, and Derla found herself lying awake in her narrow bed, listening to the wind howl outside and thinking about what it would be like to leave this place in the spring. She tried to imagine herself in one of the northern territories, living among other orcs, finally safe from the fear and prejudice that had dogged her for years. It should have been a comforting thought, the fulfillment of the goal she had been working toward for so long. But every time she tried to picture it, the image slipped away, replaced by the memory of Warren's smile and the sound of his laughter, and the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he was trying not to laugh at one of his own jokes. She was in love with him. Completely, irrevocably in love with a human man who had shown her kindness when she expected cruelty, and who had somehow made her feel like she mattered. And she had no idea what to do about it. In mid-January, a storm rolled in that was fierce enough to keep them both inside for 3 days straight. The wind screamed around the house, and the snow fell so thickly that it was impossible to see more than a few feet beyond the windows. Warren kept the fires burning, and Derla cooked simple meals that could be stretched across multiple days, and they existed in the small space of the farmhouse like two ghosts haunting the same ground. On the third day, when the storm finally began to ease, Warren broke the silence. "I am sorry," he said abruptly, looking up from the trap he was mending. "I have been acting like a sulky child, and you do not deserve that." Derla set down the shirt she was mending and looked at him warily. "You have not been sulky, just quiet. Same thing in my case." Warren set aside the trap and rubbed a hand over his face. "The truth is, I do not want you to leave. I know that is selfish, and I know you have your own plans, but I have been dreading spring since the day you told me you had almost enough saved. And instead of being an adult about it and telling you how I feel, I have been moping around like an idiot." Derla's heart was suddenly beating very fast. "How you feel?" she repeated carefully. Warren met her eyes, and there was no humor in his expression now, just raw honesty. "I am in love with you, Derla. I think I have been for months, but I did not let myself admit it because I knew you were leaving and I did not want to make things harder for you. But then you won that ribbon and you looked so happy, and all I could think was that I wanted to see that look on your face every day for the rest of my life. And then you reminded me that you are leaving, and it felt like someone had kicked me in the chest. Derla could not breathe, could not think, could only stare at Warren and try to process the fact that he had just said he loved her. "I am an orc," she said stupidly, because that was the first coherent thought that managed to surface. "I noticed," Warren said with a ghost of his usual humor. "Turns out I do not care. People will talk. They already do. It will only get worse. Let them talk. I stopped caring what people think about me a long time ago. You will lose friends, respect. You could lose business, Derla." Warren stood and crossed to where she sat, kneeling down so they were eye level. "I do not care about any of that. The only thing I care about is you. And if you want to go north in the spring, I will help you pack and I will wish you well, and I will never forgive myself for not telling you how I feel. But if there is any part of you that wants to stay, if there is any chance that you might feel the same way I do, then I am begging you to give us a chance." Derla's vision blurred with tears, and she realized she was crying, something she had not allowed herself to do in years. "I am terrified," she whispered. "I am terrified that I will stay and you will realize you made a mistake, that you will wake up one day and see me the way everyone else does, as something ugly and wrong. I do not think I could survive that, Warren, not from you." Warren reached up and gently wiped the tears from her cheeks, his touch impossibly tender. "I see you," he said fiercely. "I see you, Derla, not an orc, not a hired worker. You, the woman who learned to cook on a cursed stove because she refused to give up. The woman who won a baking competition with my mother's recipe and made me cry over a pie. The woman who sits by the fire at night and listens to me read terrible adventure novels and never once complains about how bad they are. I see you, and you are the most beautiful thing in my world." The last of Derla's resistance crumbled. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead against Warren's, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders, and let herself feel the hope that she had been pushing away for months. "I love you," she said, the words coming out choked and raw. "I love you and I want to stay. I am so tired of running." Warren's answering smile was brilliant, and he kissed her, soft and careful, as if she were something precious. Derla kissed him back, letting herself believe for the first time that maybe, just maybe, she had found a place where she belonged. They spent the rest of the storm-locked days talking, laying out all the fears and hopes they had been holding back. Warren told her about the loneliness that had haunted him since his mother's death, the way the house had felt empty and cold until Derla arrived. Derla told him about the years of running, the border camps and the narrow escapes, and the constant fear that had shaped her life. They made plans, tentative and hopeful, about what their life together might look like. "We will probably have to deal with some ugliness from the village," Warren admitted. "Not everyone is going to be happy about this." "I know," Derla said, "but if you are willing to face it, then so am I." "Together," Warren said, taking her hand, "we will face it together." The rest of the winter passed in a kind of golden haze. Derla still cooked and kept house, and Warren still ran his trap lines, but everything was different now, softened by the knowledge that they were building something together. They were careful in public, aware that the village was already watching them with curiosity and suspicion. But in the privacy of the farmhouse, they were free to be themselves. Warren taught Derla to read better, sitting with her in the evenings and working through the adventure novels he loved so much. Derla taught Warren some of the orc songs her mother had sung to her when she was small, haunting melodies that spoke of mountains and long journeys. They laughed together, argued over silly things, and learned the rhythms of each other's moods and needs. In March, when the snow began to melt and the first green shoots appeared in the garden, Warren asked Derla to marry him. It was not a grand proposal, just a quiet question asked while they were washing dishes after supper, But Derla's answer was immediate and sure. "Yes," she said, and kissed him with soapy hands and a heart so full it felt like it might burst. They were married in April by a traveling priest who came through Fernwick, a simple ceremony with Mabel and a handful of Warren's friends in attendance. There were no decorations, no fancy clothes, just two people standing in front of the fireplace in the farmhouse and promising to love each other for the rest of their lives. When the priest pronounced them married, Warren kissed Derla like she was the answer to every prayer he had ever whispered, and Derla kissed him back and thought that maybe the North had never been her destination after all. Maybe home had been waiting here all along, in a small farmhouse with a cursed stove and a man who smiled at burned meals and asked for another helping. The village slowly adjusted to the reality of Warren and Derla's marriage, some with grudging acceptance and others with open hostility. There were still whispers and sidelong glances, still people who crossed the street rather than walk past Derla. But there were also people like Mabel who greeted her warmly, and the healer who nodded respectfully when they passed, and the farmer with the orchards who brought them a basket of apples in the fall, and said he hoped they were as sweet as the pie Derla had made for the competition. Derla learned to live with the mixture of acceptance and rejection, to focus on the people who mattered rather than those who did not. She and Warren built a life together, season by season, planting a garden and fixing up the barn and planning for the future. 2 years after their marriage, their first child was born, a son with Warren's dark hair and Derla's green-tinged skin. They named him Perrin, and he was perfect. Warren cried when he held him for the first time, and Derla felt a fierce protectiveness settle over her that was unlike anything she had ever known. This was her family, her home, and she would defend it with everything she had. Perrin was 2 when their daughter was born, a squalling bundle of energy with tusks that were just beginning to show and eyes that were the same hazel as her father's. They named her Sable, and she completed their family in a way that felt inevitable and right. The years that followed were not always easy. There were hard winters and failed crops, illnesses and injuries, and the constant low-grade tension of being different in a community that valued sameness. But there were also good years, abundant harvests and quiet evenings by the fire, watching their children grow and thrive. Derla continued to cook, and her reputation grew beyond Fernwick. People came from neighboring villages to buy her bread and pies, and eventually she was able to turn her skills into a small but steady income that helped support the family. Warren's trapping business flourished, and together they made enough to not just survive but to build a comfortable life. Every year they went to the winter fair in Fernwick, and every year Derla entered the baking competition. She did not win every time Mabel and even Constance took the ribbon some years, but she won often enough that people stopped thinking of her as Warren's orc wife and started thinking of her as Derla the baker. It was a small shift, but it mattered. On a bright afternoon in early December, 10 years after that first disastrous meal, Derla stood in the village hall at the winter fair and watched as her daughter carefully arranged a plate of cookies on the entry table. Sable was 8 years old and had inherited her mother's determination along with her father's charm, and she had insisted on entering the children's division of the baking competition. "You think they look all right?" Sable asked anxiously, adjusting one of the cookies for the 3rd time. "They look perfect," Derla assured her, crouching down to Sable's level. "And even if you do not win, you should be proud. You worked hard on those cookies." "Did you work hard on your first meal for Papa?" Sable asked with a child's blunt curiosity. Derla laughed. "I did, and it was terrible. I burned it so badly that it was almost inedible. But Papa ate it anyway," Perrin chimed in. He was 10 now, tall for his age and already showing signs of the man he would become. He always tells that story. Says it was the worst stew he ever had and the best meal of his life because it meant you were staying. Derla felt her throat tighten with emotion, the way it always did when she thought about how far they had come. "Your father is a sentimental fool," she said affectionately. "I heard that," Warren said, appearing behind her with a cup of cider in each hand. He handed one to Derla and took a sip of his own, his eyes twinkling. "And I stand by what I said. That burned stew changed my life." "It almost ended your life," Derla countered. "You could have choked on the charcoal. Worth the risk." Warren slipped an arm around her waist and pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Best decision I ever made, asking for another helping." Around them, the winter fair carried on, full of music and laughter and the warmth of community. Derla leaned into her husband's embrace and watched their children examining the other entries with serious expressions, and felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. She had set out all those years ago with a plan to reach the Northern Territories, to find safety and belonging among her own kind. But she had found something better here, in this small frontier village with a man who had looked at her burned cooking and smiled. She had found home, not in a place where everyone looked like her, but in a place where she was loved for exactly who she was. The judges announced the winners of the children's division, and Sable did not take the ribbon, but she earned an honorable mention that made her beam with pride. Perrin cheered loudly enough that people turned to stare, and Warren hoisted Sable onto his shoulders so she could see over the crowd. Derla stood beside them, her family, and thought about that first evening when she had been so certain she would be sent away. She had been wrong about so many things. Wrong about her ability to learn, wrong about her place in the world, wrong about what home could mean. But Warren had been right. He had seen something in her that she had not seen in herself, and he had given her the space and support to grow into it. That evening, back at the farmhouse that had become truly theirs over the years, they gathered around the table for supper. Derla had made chicken and dumplings, the recipe that had once seemed impossible and was now as familiar as breathing. The children chattered about the fair, recounting their favorite moments, and Warren listened with the patient attention of a man who understood that these were the moments that mattered. After the children were in bed, Warren and Derla sat by the fire, her head resting on his shoulder and his arm around her waist. The house was quiet except for the crackle of the flames and the soft sound of their breathing. "You ever think about the North?" Warren asked softly. "About what your life would have been like if you had kept going." Derla considered the question seriously, because Warren deserved honesty. "Sometimes," she admitted. "I wonder what it would have been like to live somewhere without stares and whispers. But then I think about everything I would have missed. You, our children, this life we built together, and I cannot imagine giving any of that up." "No regrets?" Warren asked, and then immediately made a face. "Sorry, that is a terrible question. Forget I asked." Derla laughed softly. "No regrets," she said firmly. "Not about staying, not about loving you, not about any of it. This is where I was meant to be." Warren tightened his arm around her, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down to embers. Outside, the winter wind whispered through the pines, and snow began to fall in soft, lazy flakes. Inside, the farmhouse was warm and full of the quiet peace that comes from being exactly where you belong. Derla thought about that burned stew, about the moment when Warren had smiled and asked for another helping, about how a single act of kindness had changed the course of her entire life. She thought about all the meals she had cooked since then, the successes and failures, the recipes learned and perfected. But most of all, she thought about the family she had built, the home she had made, and the love that had grown from the most unlikely of beginnings. And as she drifted off to sleep that night in the bed she shared with her husband, with her children safe in their rooms and the house settling around them, Derla Ingram smiled and knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The girl who had burned the evening meal had found her place in the world, and it was here, in this small farmhouse on the frontier, with the man who had looked past her mistakes and seen her worth. The next morning dawned clear and cold, and Derla woke to the smell of coffee brewing and the sound of Warren moving around in the kitchen. She dressed quickly and padded out to find him attempting to make breakfast, a task he still approached with more enthusiasm than skill. "Need help?" she asked, leaning against the doorframe with a smile. Warren looked up from the pan of eggs he was scrambling and grinned sheepishly. "Probably. I was trying to surprise you, but I think I am about 30 seconds away from burning these." Derla crossed to the stove and gently took over, salvaging the eggs before they could turn into the kind of charcoal she had once specialized in. Warren wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder, and they stood like that for a moment, comfortable and content in the morning light. "Thank you," Warren said quietly, "for saving breakfast, for staying, for loving me, for building this life with me, for everything." Derla turned in his arms and kissed him, soft and sweet, and when she pulled back she saw her own happiness reflected in his eyes. "Thank you for asking for another helping," she said. "That terrible, burned, inedible helping that started everything." Warren laughed, the sound warm and bright, and Derla thought that of all the recipes she had learned over the years, the most important one had nothing to do with food. It was the recipe for building a home. Start with kindness, add patience and humor, let love rise slowly, and never be afraid to try again when things burn. It was a recipe she would spend the rest of her life perfecting, and she could not imagine a better way to live.